architecture doing here? I thought I have some responsibility, first of all, to say what we do, because a lot of people have a conception that all we do are things like this, right? So first, we know architecture is things like this, right? You know, this is the tallest building in the world. This was a graduate of a school of, well, hundreds of graduates of schools of architecture producing this building, a magnificent building. And when we think of architecture, we know that the discipline extends to many different aspects of things dealing with buildings, but what we often don't think about is the diversity of what our profession does, primarily because of, we don't really use the term as much, but entrepreneurship, right? So when we look at buildings, we also look at things like this, like the impact of buildings in the world. That an architect produced that building, and that building became so iconic that it led to the production of a Lego artifact, is an architectural situation, right? That thing in that box is not necessarily architecture, but we need to know about it and think about it in our discipline. We also do a lot of this. We do a lot of writing. Our discipline is full of historians and scholars and theorists and cultural theorists who work as architects in the same way that people who design buildings work as architects. We give them mostly the same degree. Of course, we have doctoral and master's degrees in our field, but most of our field is dominated by master's graduates, and so that kind of terminal degree allows people to really kind of find their way and discover what they define architecture to be. So we make the buildings, we study the Legos, we write the books, and we also are confronted with things that many people, even in our discipline, don't think belongs to our discipline, which is this kind of stuff. This is architecture, and interestingly, I think if we ask most people outside of the discipline if this is architecture, they'll say yes. But if you ask people in the discipline, they'll say no. And that's because there's this kind of strange elitism about what constitutes our discipline, even when so much of this stuff is radically transforming the country in which we live. So we need to study this too. We need to know how those things are made. We need to know why they fit out. We need to know why people like those. But that's a lot of what we do. This is also architecture. Recently, with computational tools, so much of our discipline has transmogrified from kind of manual design practices to computationally driven design practices. And so this is part of what I teach in the School of Architecture, actually, is programming. I teach students how to develop concepts of building through computer programming, how they draw, how they design, how computation as a rule system can actually inform architecture. So that's architecture, right? This is architecture, too. A fascinating chunk of our profession intentionally designs things that are never intended to be built at all. Right? It's a theoretical practice that is meant to provoke, to think critically about the impact that these things have in our world, and the way they do that is by designing things that actually will never make it, but they'll make it because they're so extreme, or so provocative, or so strange, that the very looking at them is provocative. It makes us think about, you know, do I want to live in one of those things? What does it mean to think about a mobile population the size of a high-rise in New York? Architecture also is this. My fantasy school of architecture, if I were a dean of a school of architecture, it wouldn't just be building architecture, it would be all these too. These are things we've all heard of. Many of you have probably used these terms on a regular basis, the information architecture, systems architecture, or whatever you may be working with. These are architectures, sure, maybe a bit more metaphorical, but what they borrow from the core practice, the historic practice of architecture, the master putter together is what an architect is in its etymology. Is the structuring of things and the spatialization of that structuring. That we have complex information systems that somehow, by looking at their spatial relationships and structuring those relationships, we are able to produce a higher level of knowledge through information systems. So we have a whole bunch of stuff that really defines the breadth of our discipline. And so the question is, what in these is entrepreneurial? If that's already the ground plane of what architecture is, how do you develop a kind of entrepreneurial vision in that, right? So it's very broad, but it also poses some problems because so much of what we do as just an everyday part of our practice is to constantly think outside the box. Well, first of all, if you Google architecture and entrepreneurialism, it'll tell you about many, many people starting firms. Well, most of our graduates go and start firms, and it has been this way probably since about 1200. This is what you do. You get a degree in architecture. You look at the field of architecture practices that are working out there. You often have some wealthy relative, and they want to design a house or a garage, and they will hire you. And so you say, hey, I've got a firm. And so you hang your shingle as soon as you can. When you're fresh out of school, you have to, because of the law, get other people to formally sign your drawings, but you can call yourself an architectural designer. the design of something that would actually exist in the world, right? The firm that did this building started this way. In the 1970s, they were a really great group of graduates from the Ivy Leagues. They went into practice on their own. They designed their parents' garage. These were trust fund kids. They designed their parents' garage. That garage got fantastic press because it looked unlike any other garage that the history of architecture had seen. And then they went on to develop many, many more buildings until they're now a well-established international firm. So entrepreneurialism in architecture is not starting a firm. And if I were to really be provocative, I would say it's not just that anywhere. In the same way that architecture is not just a building. I mean, you all know, and you study these things, that entrepreneurialism is a much more complex thing, and it does it a mistreatment to think it's just starting a firm. But in the same way, it's a mistreatment of architecture to think it's just a building. So how do we merge these concepts and try to understand what it is that cutting edge aspect of our discipline that really defines entrepreneurialism when, your general, average student of architecture is likely to go start their own firm. So I define it, and this is based on a little bit of understanding of the discipline as it moves into a more entrepreneurial direction through schools that are actually teaching architecture and entrepreneurialism, is defined really as an innovation in the way you explore the agency of architecture, the effect of architecture in the world, right? So just going to make another building is not entrepreneurial. Just going to start a firm to make buildings is not entrepreneurial. Having a cool idea about what a building could be is not entrepreneurial, because if you don't have a cool idea for what a building is going to be, you just don't build anything, right? I mean, every building has to have some creative idea behind it, which is different than other buildings. So one of the things that I think is really core to our profession, and I borrow this term, you may have run into this before, John Wood from Goldsmiths College in the Department of Design coined a number of years ago the concept of Entredonneurship instead of Entrepreneurship. And he's basing this on the etymology of the core of these words in French, where prene is based on the French word to take, donner is the French word to give. And he couples and pairs entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurialism, very difficult word to say, by saying it's really a kind of literally a give and take, right? If we see the world only through entrepreneurial lenses, what we do is it's not just a taking between, but also a giving between. And I think design is this is really important for design. Because what we do is we put things in the world. We give. Our innovation consists really in a give and take process that doesn't, but it's not just about the individual changing, the individual innovator. It's the fact that in this very place where I'm standing right now, there was nothing for a long time, millennia. And then someone came along and called it a building site and built something. Well, it was insufficient for what the university needed. So that building was torn down and this thing was built, right? We're able to stand in this space because of an attitude which is innovative, which is entrepreneurial, but is also a giving. It's a really significant way of thinking about agency in the world. So, a scenario. And what I thought I would do, given that many of you are students looking at what to do at that kind of cusp, whether or not there's a place for you in these disciplines, I really like the concept of how we operate, or how you're operating within this to sort of see entrepreneurialism across these disciplines. This is student work, and this is student work based on a course I was doing recently to sort of try to define for students what that entrepreneurial vision could be when they go out in the world. So how not to just design another building, but to think about that agency. So I told them, imagine you're employed at some firm, and that firm operates in some city, and that city has sort of undertaken a new ethical project to say, you know what, we need to think about the ecologies of the city we live in. When we build another building, we need to think about, and you're building a building for a new client and they're leaving another building, we need to think about what happens to that old building. We can't just ask you as a designer to design something new and forget about the fact that you're just leaving an empty building behind. But you're required to think about that other building. What do you do, right? How do you think about that? So what this gave to the students was a sort of definition of architecture to say, an entrepreneurial attitude of architecture might say that architecture is a systemic understanding of what a new building might do in the world, right? It's going to cost a lot. It's going to consume material. It's going to change the ecosystem underneath it. It's going to affect the way people move. It's going to create pollution. So it also gives them an ethical responsibility to address them and an admission that they can't do this alone. That in order to be that entrepreneur, they have to do something that requires a very different